Unfortunately, all of our lives we've grown up under Keynesian economics. Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we discuss Keynesian economics. I'm Jim Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled and compromising case for libertarianism. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org, where Richard has a monthly article in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and also we reprint a weekly article by him. And you got 30 years worth of principled arguments on libertarianism on virtually all political and economic positions. And we're going to talk today about a subject that is pretty popular. It's especially in universities, colleges all across America, but also the mainstream press. And that's what we call Keynesian economics. Now, let me give a little background for Richard, because he's going to be carrying the ball in most of this discussion. He's an economics professor at the Citadel. And Richard is what we call an Austrian economist, which I would say is the exact opposite of Keynesian economics. But he's well-versed in Keynesian economics. He was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. He was president of the Foundation for Economic Education, taught economics at Northwood University. Now he teaches economics at the Citadel, where he's the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise Leadership and Ethics.
Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership.
Okay. So, Richard, you know, we all grow up with Keynesian economics. I mean, it's most college students are exposed to Keynesian economics. That's certainly what I was versed in. I was an economics major in college, and I learned the whole Keynesian paradigm. I didn't even know of the Austrian paradigm. I suppose I got exposed to the monetarist school, but by and large, my college education, which I think is most people's college education in economics, deals with Keynesian economics. And there's that famous saying, I forget who said it now, that we're all Keynesians now. It's back in the 70s, I guess. So why don't you give us a little synopsis of what this philosophy, this system is all about, and how it came to be so popular in America, in the world, really.
Well, let me sort of start off as to why it is pertinent or relevant today. After all, Keynes wrote his famous book, which became sort of the Bible of Keynesian economics, a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in 1936. That's a very long time ago. And Keynes himself died in 1946 of a heart attack. So what is its pertinence now? Well, the fact that there is a revival of Keynesian type thinking, one particular element or form of it has become known in the media as modern monetary theory, MMT. And the gist of this modern monetary theory is that government doesn't need to tax. Government can just either print or borrow money, and it never has to worry about deficits or accumulated debt. The idea being that as long as a government controls its own currency, it's not dependent upon acquiring sums of money from another government and the central bank in that other country. It has ability to print unlimited amounts of money for the government to cover all of its expenses, to do all of the good things that may be believed from a social welfare point of view desirable to do. If an economy has fallen into general or wide unemployment, production is far from full capacity, and the market has failed to restore the balancing of the economy to that full employment level, then all that the government has to do is either to borrow money or even more importantly, print money and use that money to stimulate or directly do investment, create jobs, enhanced employment, grow the economy. And it can do this without really having to tax, just print money. And so then what is the role of taxes in this new modern monetary theory paradigm? Government should only tax when the economy starts reaching full employment due to the stimulus that the government has created by printing and spending all this money. And now with the economy reaching full employment, sort of finally reaching scarcity, prices will rise. So the purpose of taxing is not to cover government spending, but to siphon off dollars out of the economy to dampen the pressures of rising prices. And of course, to do this, because you have to do it from a proper social progressive perspective, you would then be using these taxes in differential ways to bring about a greater degree of income equality, sort of two birds with one stone. But that's basically it. So where do these people get this idea? And of course, what's the reasonableness or validity behind it? Well, it all begins, or it has its modern origin, in fact, with John Maynard Keynes. The Great Depression struck in the early 1930s. And it came as a great surprise to virtually everyone. People lost their shirts in the stock market. People were jumping out of windows. Their life was over financially. People, not everybody, but enough to make a public impression. People jumping out of windows to commit suicide because they've lost everything. Banks had runs and people lost their savings. Unemployment at the worst or bottom of the Depression, 1932, early 1933, reached, as measured by the government, 25% of the labor force. Production in agriculture fell by about 40%. Industrial production fell well over 35%. International trade, in terms of real goods and services, collapsed by 50%. All of this in a matter of 2.5, 3 years. This is clearly a catastrophic downturn. So the question was, why did this happen? And even more importantly, how do you get out of it? Now, there were conflicting theories, of which, as you mentioned, the Austrian economists, specifically people such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, had one version. But before I sort of get looped back to them, how did Keynes see this? Now, actually, from the early 1920s, Keynes had advocated activist government monetary and fiscal policy. In the aftermath of the First World War and unemployment in Great Britain at the time, and attempts to get Britain back on a gold standard, which it had gone off during the war, Keynes believed that what Britain needed was a managed currency. Don't link it to gold. Don't put shackles on the hands of the government of how much paper money they could print. And government, therefore, should be sort of the monetary central planner to assure growth and full employment. Now, he went through various permutations of this. He presented one in 1930, which he believed would make him recognized as one of the greatest monetary theorists of his time. This was in a 2-volume work called The Treatise on Money. The only problem, Jacob, was that when the book appeared in 1930, over the next year or two, almost all the prominent economists who were well recognized as scholars and serious professors at that time, both in Europe and the United States, many of them wrote reviews or long essay reviews. And they basically trashed the book, saying the premises are incoherent, the logic is defective, the causal analysis in any way relating to the real world seems to be very loose. And then in a coup de grace, this Austrian economist, Friedrich Hayek, who was then a very young man in his early 30s, wrote a lengthy 2-part review essay in a British journal called Economica. And that was considered, the final thrust, because basically Hayek demonstrated all of the fundamental flaws, shortcomings, inconsistencies, contradictions, and factual imaginings of the book. So Keynes basically went back to Cambridge. He was a professor at Cambridge. He was living the college's, the university's bursar. He managed its finances. Licking his wounds, he spent the next 5 years writing a totally different book. And this became the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which, as I said, was published in February 1936. And his premises are the following. First, the market economy is inherently irrational and unstable. The behavior of investors, the behavior of savers and consumers, the mindsets of workers were all such that once you got into a recession or a depression, their reactions to it would always make the situation worse. Let me just give a couple of examples of this. You go into a recession, market demand for a variety of goods decreases. Employers are finding it difficult to generate enough revenue from sales to maintain their labor force at what had been the prevailing wages of that time. So for employees to maintain their employable status, if prices are going down, it would not be unreasonable for workers to rationally say, well, if I only have to take a wage cut, a money wage cut, that is more or less in line with how much prices are falling, in real buying terms, I'm no worse off. If a basket of goods is $100 and a worker was earning $100, but now he found that the basket of goods had decreased in cost to $50, then in principle, he could take a 50% cut in his money wage and be no worse off in terms of his real buying power. His $50 money income would still buy now that same basket of goods and services at $50. So wouldn't it be rational to be accommodating on the wages that you're insisting upon as an employee if you can keep your jobs and more or less your real standard of living may not be that much worse off? But Keynes believed that workers suffered from money illusion. They only cared about their money wages, that is the number of dollars in their paycheck. And that even if the demand had gone down and prices were declining and a wage cut would not make them relatively that worse off in real buying terms, no, they're irrational. It's a long and difficult process to get them to accept lower money wages. Now, those less sympathetic to Keynes were basically saying at the time, Keynes is taking this view because it is politically incorrect to call for cuts in money wages. Why? Because you'd have to buck the unions. And in the night out of the First World War in the 20s, British labor unions in relative terms had grown and become very powerful. And in the early 30s, they were adamantly insistent that there will be no cut in wages. If you maintain wages, then workers have the income to buy things. And so as a man of the left, Keynes, like many others on the left and in the middle of that time, were totally unwilling to buck, did not workers, but the unions represent the interests of workers? Did they not have a lot of political clout and it would be a long battle to fight them to get them to accept declines in money wages to preserve full employment? So it was easier to say that workers just suffer from this irrational money illusion, and rather than have workers cut wages and go through this long, prolonged political battle in the labor market, why not have government run budget deficits, either by borrowing money that was idle in banks that others were not using for investment purposes, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or just print the money, have the central bank print the money, and increase demand for output as a whole, push prices back up, so that by pushing demand and price up, given the money wages that workers won't take cuts in, you've restored profit margins again to make it once again attractive to employ all those who had been driven into unemployment. So as Keynes says in the book, it is easier to get workers to accept a cut in their real wages via rising prices than to get them to accept a cut in their money wages, even if it would leave their real standard of living not much different than it had been before. So workers just won't take wage cuts. Well, that's a problem. Now, what about investors? You know, if demand is slack and people are spending less, then they're saving more, right? By definition, de facto, they're saving more. There's maybe more sitting in the banks. Won't they borrow the money? Well, and create an alternative demand, thinking about, investments that will generate production in the future when better times will have been restored, and you'll have the capacity and the output to meet that future better times demand. No, Keynes insists that businessmen are guided by animal spirits. And what does that mean? It means that businessmen are uncertain about the future. Well, I mean, it's phrased that way. Who's going to disagree with that, right? Everyone's a bit uncertain about the future. What he says is that there's a sort of like a musical chairs. One investor asks another investor, what do you think tomorrow is going to be like? Well, I think it's going to be gloomy. Why do you think it's going to be gloomy? Because Joe says so. And then you ask Joe, why do you think it's gloomy? Because I asked Sam, and Sam is an informed guy. And then you ask Sam, and Sam says, well, I think things are gloomy because Bob told me. And it goes in the circle, and who does it come back to? The first person who was asking, what do you think? You see, musical chairs of optimism and pessimism. So business investment investors and entrepreneurs are radically irrational. They're optimistic and they're pessimistic. They invest and they cut back. They create jobs and they let workers off. And then the workers won't take wage cuts, and it just multiplies of lost demands in incomes and employments. So then what becomes the solution to this in Keynes's eyes? Well, in Keynes's eyes is that there's one institution, one agency in the market, in the society, that is forward-looking, rational, dispassionate, can look beyond the fears and uncertainties of the moment. And what is that institution, that agency? The big G, government. Why businessmen are scared, scaredy pants, but the politician, with people like Keynes whispering in their ear, oh, don't worry, do this, don't do that. Spend money, lower tax, run a deficit. Okay. And the economy can be put back on an even keel. And then, if you've reached full employment, and the economy seems to maybe now be overheating out of all this extra money and full employment and full output, and can't go any place more than other than rising prices because of the scarcity of things, then government should cut back on the size of the deficits and raise taxes to siphon the money out of the economy. So if you understand this, you understand where this modern monetary theory is getting its core foundations. It's just another variation on the Keynesian thing. And let me mention a couple of other things about Keynes. Keynes believed in people planning. In the 1920s, he was one of those people who believed in eugenics. If we're going to rationally look after the interests of the society, an activist government planning, production, employment, balancing things, we have to now think about not only the number of people, but the quality of people. And of all places, he emphasizes this in a lecture that he gave in Berlin, Germany in 1925, a lecture called The End of Laissez-Faire. And clearly that was the end of laissez-faire to having kids, because that was going to have to be planned by the state. How many you had and the quality through breeding. Now, he, of course, was not alone in this. It's become notorious how many progressives and people on the left, like George Bernard Shaw and others, believed in all of this nonsense. But he believed in that. And at the same time, he went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. He, in fact, ended up marrying a Russian ballerina. They ended up happily married, but he married a Russian ballerina. But anyway, so he makes his tour of Russia, and he says, anyone who's been growing up in Britain and the spirit of freedom in Britain, the Bolsheviks seem a little rough around the edges. They seem to do bad things to your body, and they won't let you speak your mind. So that's not for me. But where do the Russians have a peg over us? They take the long-run planning perspective. They can marshal resources. They look beyond the uncertainties of the moment. And anything those rough, around the edge Bolsheviks could do with their dictatorship, we could do with enlightened democratic planning far better right here at home in Great Britain. So this was the mindset with which Keynes approached these things. And it dominates our policy today. The government is running these huge budget deficits. The Federal Reserve is creating trillions of dollars of new money, all with the short-run perspective of trying to keep employment going, boost up production, and think about nothing but tomorrow. But remember, they're the ones who take the long-run view as opposed to the fickle businessmen.
Yeah, that's an excellent synopsis. It's interesting that you go back to the Great Depression, because it seems to me that this was the perfect opportunity for Roosevelt and his statist cohorts to justify what they wanted to do anyway. I mean, here was this reputable economist that was saying, "Oh, well, this is what you're doing is fine in terms of controlling the economy, managing the economy, using the Federal Reserve to prime the pump and so forth." It was providing intellectual legitimacy to what they were doing, which was really an abandonment of the principle of genuine free enterprise, which is where you have an economy that is free of all this stuff. And the other fascinating part about the New Deal and what was happening during the 1930s was Roosevelt's ability to convince people that all of this was free enterprise, that it was actually designed to save the free enterprise system, when actually it was the exact opposite. I mean, this was really the watershed period in terms of America's domestic economy. This was the advent of the welfare state, Social Security, which is still with us today. I mean, here it was like this emergency measure during the Great Depression, but it was never a temporary measure. It was always going to be a permanent change in the thinking. I mean, this was the socialist welfare state tide that was overcoming America and the world. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but central to this idea of Keynesianism is government control, government intervention, government management, whether it's through fiscal policy of raising taxes and lowering taxes to manipulate things, or through monetary policy where they're lowering interest rates, expanding the money supply, and that, in fact, rather than do what they say they do, that when things are prospering, they start contracting or they start lowering taxes. The situation is always worse than it was before they started tinkering, and to the point where we are today, where the dollar's been devalued. I don't know how much. I mean, it's worth pennies compared to where it was in 1930s, when, before the gold standard was abolished. And I should mention that Roosevelt did that just through first through fiat and then through legislative action, which, how do you amend a constitution with legislative action? That's ridiculous. The Constitution is the supreme law that's supposed to control Congress and the president and the judiciary. And here our ancestors had established a gold coin standard, a silver coin standard. Roosevelt abandons that entirely. And that was the start of the out of control spending and debt that ultimately, really devalued the monetary system to a point where it's a shadow of what it was back in the 1930s. And of course, the people who paid the biggest price are the people on pensions, fixed incomes. I recently read an article where a lady, get this, she was the daughter of a Civil War veteran that just died, the daughter of a Civil War veteran. And she was getting a pension of $93 a month. Well, that's a pittance. Who's going to live on $93? But I did some calculating in terms of gold coins that, her father would have been receiving three $20 gold coins. That's $60 right there. And each one contained about an ounce of gold. And an ounce of gold today, you can get a 1 ounce gold coin for $2,000. That's $6,000 a month plus the extra 10. It'd be about $7,000 a month, which is nothing to scoff at. That shows you what this Keynesian model building has done to this country. What do you think?
Well, you were mentioning about, its consistency beginning with Roosevelt with the traditional American constitutional order of taxing and Congress approving things. In fact, there was an American economist named Lawrence Klein. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics in the 70s or 1980s, I forget. He's passed away since then. But in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, 1947-48, he wrote a book called The Keynesian Revolution. And it was meant to be a popularized version of Keynes's ideas, to have like a supplement in the classroom, or just for people to read, buying it in the bookstore. Well, what is this Keynesian stuff? And towards the end of the book, after having developed, the Keynesian framework, the paradigm, he then gets, well, what are the implications for policy in America? And he says a number of things there, among the following. One, Americans should not be afraid of government taking on these economic responsibilities of control, management, and planning, because they're not losing freedom when the government controls, manages, and plans. They're getting a higher and better and more important freedom, freedom from unemployment, freedom from the insecurities of life, freedom of not knowing what will happen in their old age. And in fact, he says, and one of the purposes of Social Security is not only to have a buffer to see that the elderly have income to maintain demand in the economy, but to wean people away from savings. The problem, according to Keynes, is that as people get wealthier, they save too much and they consume too little. And by reducing their consumption, they're decreasing the demand for goods and services and therefore undermining the sustainability of full employment in the economy. So you want Social Security to get people to give up this perverse notion that they need to save and plan for their own old age. Okay? And then finally, he says, well, if government is going to act actively like this, it has to be able to turn the dials and push the button and adjust the gadgets of monetary and fiscal policy. The Constitution is structured that government works too slowly. A bill has to start in the House of Representatives when it involves taxing and spending. It has to go through the committees and to the floor of the House. Then it has to be sent over to the Senate. And the Senate, through its own committees, have to prepare their own version of this. And then there has to be a reconciliation committee. And then the two houses have to vote on the reconciled version. And then it goes to the president. And the president either signs or vetoes. This can take weeks. This could take months to get through Congress on a spending and taxing bill. All this time, the economy could be going crazy, collapsing into a recession, rising unemployment. We need action now. So what he called was a change in the constitutional structure, that there be a central taxing and spending committee with the discretionary authority overriding and no longer needing congressional bill approval to raise taxes here, lower taxes there, increase spending here, lower spending there, so as to micromanage the macro economy to assure full employment. In other words, the end of traditional American constitutional government. That was the interpretation by one prominent Keynesian in the American setting, that Keynesian economics required the jettisoning of the constitutional structure of the United States.
Yeah, you reminded me of one of Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms: freedom from fear, that people had a right to be free from fear of what the vicissitudes of life might bring. And so government would be there to take care of them. And it is ironic that the Austrians and the monetarists, Milton Friedman, ultimately proved that what had caused the Great Depression was government mismanagement of money. And so here, that was, of course, the Federal Reserve, which had come into existence in 1913. Americans had lived without a central bank for more than a century, and without income taxation for a century. And so here in 1913, both of them come into existence. The Fed causes the Great Depression, and then Roosevelt uses this as the excuse to revolutionize the monetary system as well as the economic system. Now, when I was taking economics, Richard, there was all this model building in Keynesian economics. You had charts and graphs, and you were, showing, how things worked with a diagram and supply curves and demand curves. And I remember thinking, I was planning on going to law school, but I remember thinking, gosh, I can, when I get, out of law school and I'm thinking about the economy, I can really analyze things with these charts and graphs and curves and so forth. It was ridiculous. I mean, when I discovered Austrian economics, I realized this is so ludicrous. Why? Well, because it has no bearing on real life. Real life deals with human beings interacting in a marketplace. And that's one of the things I found so attractive about the Austrian paradigm, is the Austrians talk in terms of real people. That they enter into a marketplace, they enter into transactions, they use money, and they interact for their own purposes, out of their own self-interest, and out of this comes a spontaneous order, as Friedrich Hayek said, that produces things the likes of which nobody can even predict, because they're utilizing the all of the knowledge and expertise of individuals, millions of individuals all across the society, all across the world, rather than the central model builder, the central planner that Keynes envisioned in the government, which of course ends up with what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. And so it seems to me that that's one of the real distinguishing characteristics of Austrian economics, is that you're dealing with real human beings and you're dealing with a market process that really means what it says when it says free markets. It's entirely a market process that is free of all this Keynesian model building, all the Keynesian interventions, the taxation, the monetary central planning, and so forth. That a free enterprise system really means that an economic system that is totally free of any government control, management, or interference.
In that context, since it's one thing to try to point out premises behind Keynesian economics and what are the consequences and the flaws, but what is the correct analysis for what caused the Great Depression, and what would have been a better solution to it? And that is precisely looking at the way the Austrians saw it. Austrian economists such as Ludwig von Mises and particularly Friedrich Hayek argued that in the 1920s, the seeds of the Great Depression had been sown by Federal Reserve, that is American central bank policy. In the aftermath of the First World War, which had basically been, had the new Federal Reserve basically fund 40% of all the government spending in the war. The Federal Reserve printed money to cover about 40% of Woodrow Wilson's defense and war spending. The economy went through a rather short but very severe depression in 1920-21. That's an interesting case, which would be tangential, because it really shows that government doesn't have to be the solution to these things. Because what the Harding government did was that rather than running budget deficits, they lowered taxes, but cut spending even more. So the net effect was a government budget surplus and was paying off the debt. And an environment in which markets were left alone with adaptive competition and flexibility in wages and prices, it was what's called a V-shaped recession, very steep, but a rapid recovery. But then once that recovery occurred, the Federal Reserve decided to follow a policy proposal by a Yale University economist, a very famous Irving Fisher, well known for a particular version of the quantity theory of money. And his idea was, well, inflation is bad, rising prices in general, and deflation is bad, falling prices in general. So if inflation can be destabilizing and deflation can be destabilizing, then the optimal monetary policy is a relatively stable price level. And while it was not the only policy target, it is not unfair to say that a good degree of the focus of Federal Reserve policy from around 1922 to 1928-29 was to manage the money supply of the economy through buying and selling government securities to try to maintain a stable price level, which they did in a rather narrow statistical band. The argument that Hayek in particular made leading up to the Great Depression is that in a growing economy such as the US's was in the mid to late 1920s, that too was a high-tech era. Mechanization, electrification, the arrival of home appliances, the automobile, the airplane, the radio, supermarkets started covering the country. This was a growing economy with innovation, cost efficiencies, and expanding output in the economy of more goods and services to serve the consumer needs and desires and betterments of the population. Now, in this setting, all other things held given, if you have cost efficiencies and greater output, given people's demands for goods, you would expect prices to decrease to clear markets, given the greater demand, a greater supply in the face of market demand. But if that greater supply of many goods and services is coming through lower costs of production, then I, a businessman, can offer that product at a lower price and still make a profit because I've lowered my costs to increase that output. But rather than allowing prices to sort of gently fall, a gentle price deflation as an indication of a real increase in the standard of living, where people would have a rising standard of living, not through necessarily higher money wages, but each dollar in their pocket now buying more and better and less expensive goods at those falling prices. The Federal Reserve pumped money into the economy and created the illusion of economic stability because beneath that stable price level service, prices had been pushed up, so a relative hidden inflation. And the Federal Reserve did this by manipulating interest rates, distorting investments, and therefore causing a mismatch between saving investment and the types of investments that would have been sustainable in the long run in a more market-free environment from Fed policy. So this all came to a head in 1929 with the stock market crash. The economy fell into a tailspin. Now, the Austrian prescription was let the market adapt and adjust. Things have been thrown out of whack due to misguided Federal Reserve policy. Saving the investments have been thrown out of balance. Investments created with this artificial credit money may have to be written off or written down. Labor has to be reallocated. Resources and capital investments have to be shuffled in the economy. And while every recession involves bad times and hard times for people, that's due to the imbalances the government created before. You can't avoid the medicine to be better. But rather than doing that, as had happened in the 1920-21 recession or downturn, first Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican president before Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected in 1932 and came into office in early 1933, Hoover raised taxes, ran budget deficits, tried to, to use a term that came in the 1960s and 70s, jawbone, that is basically intimidate businesses and labor unions not to lower prices, not to lower wages, to bring supply and demands in the relative markets back into balance. So the Depression snowballed and got worse and worse. So as I said, by the bottom of it, 1932, early 1933, 25% unemployment of the labor force, dramatic falls in output and agricultural production because of tariff wars that had been instituted by the U.S. with the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, an implosion of international trade. So everything was done opposite by introducing all of these misguided and incorrect government interventions concerning prices, wages, taxing, spending, to make the situation worse rather than better. And then Roosevelt comes in and he introduces the New Deal program with basically fascist central planning. The NRA, the National Recovery Administration, imposing government-mandated cartels with price fixing on all sectors of industry and manufacturing. AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, imposing production limits and pricing controls on agriculture. So this basically imposes a rigid system of central planning over an economy that is already severely out of balance and in situations of distortion. So it's not surprising that the Depression went on and on and on. Franklin Roosevelt did not get America out of the Depression. But this meant that everything that the Austrians proposed were opposite to the ideologies, the policies, and the political expediencies of the time. And therefore, instead, you got these layers of government misguided interventions, then followed by Keynesian economics rationalizing that government should just spend, and run budget deficits and accumulated debt. And this just went through the entire 1940s. Now, I'll just have to add one other footnote, but didn't World War II get us out of the Great Depression? Well, no, it all depends on what you mean by out of the Depression. If you mean by depression a healthy, rebalanced, coordinated market economy where supplies and demands are properly in balance to sustain employment and growth, no. In 1938, the U.S. still had 15% unemployment. That's huge. In 39 and 40, and then 41 following Pearl Harbor, how does the U.S. get out of this? by following Keynesian spending policies and then conscripting everybody. Well, if you take millions of able-bodied men and put them into the armed forces, and if you take women out of the households and make them Rosie the Riveter in the war-related factories, it's not surprising that unemployment falls to practically zero. But that's not a normal recovery and a sustainable rebalance in the economy. It's basically war planning to create the illusion of getting out of bad times.
Yeah, and it's kind of perverse to sacrifice tens of thousands of American men on the battlefield and say, "Oh, see, unemployment is decreasing. Those people are no longer, need to get jobs." And you mentioned the horrors of the Great Depression. I'll share a personal account. My dad, his father, my grandfather, had the second largest insurance company in Texas, in San Antonio, where my dad grew up. And my dad told me that one day his father came home and that literally his face was white as a sheet. And he said, "I just sold the agency." And he was broke. He had extended all his customers' lines of credit, and the Great Depression hit, and he was one of the people wiped out. And he didn't commit suicide, but he was hit by a heart attack shortly after and died. I mean, if Americans at that time had realized that it was the government, the central bank that caused the Great Depression, I mean, there could have been a revolution here. There would have been so much anger, but people bought into this notion that it was the failure of free enterprise, and that got the government off the hook. Let's wrap it up with some books you might recommend. One book that comes to mind is Henry Hazlitt's book, Critics of Keynesian Economics, that is technical, but if people really want to dive into the failures and fallacies of Keynesian economics, I think that's an excellent book. The book that I always recommend to people that want to know real economics is Economic Policy by Ludwig von Mises, which was a series of speeches that he gave in Argentina in the 50s. But it's a timeless book of essays that I think that if any college student reads Economic Policy, he will know more economics than probably 95% of the economics professors across the country. So can you add to those two books, Richard?
Yes. Another book by Henry Hazlitt is not the Critics of Keynesian Economics. That's an anthology of different critics that he edited, but his own book, which came out in 1959, and it's called The Failure of the New Economics. And there he follows Keynes, in Keynes's book, The General Theory, chapter by chapter, one chapter after another, and dissects and critiques each of the chapters to the end. Then there's another book that came out around 1960 by a British economist named William H. Hutt, W.H. Hutt. It was called Keynesianism, Retrospect and Prospect. He later revised it in a slightly edited and abridged version, which was then published by Liberty Fund of Indianapolis, and that is still in print, and it's called The Keynesian Episode. Then another book would be by L. Albert Hahn, A-A-H-N, and that's called The Economics of Illusion. That's a collection of his essays that were written in the 1940s and 50s, and it is excellent. I would also mention another little book of his called Common Sense Economics, which came out in the 1960s. And then, if I have the impertinence to do so, I would recommend my own book that was published as an ebook by the Future Freedom Foundation called Monetary Central Planning in the State. A good part of that book is an explanation of the Austrian theory of money, inflation, and the business cycle, followed by an exposition and a critique of Keynesian economics, and then followed in the second half of the book a discussion of government central banking versus the case for private free competitive banking.
All right. Well, you mentioned W.H. Hutt, and it brought back fond memories. I thought I'd share them. That when I was practicing law in Dallas in the 1980s, before going into the libertarian movement, that you were over there teaching at the University of Dallas. That's where we met. And I was doing libertarianism as a hobby. I was a practicing lawyer, but my real passion was libertarianism as a hobby. And I put together a group called the Mont Dallas Society, a model after the Mont Pelerin Society, where we had a remarkable number of Austrian economists in the Dallas area. There was Roger Garrison and no, not yeah, Roger Garrison was, I think,
Yeah.
Gary Short, Jeannie Short, his wife, who was working at the Fed, and then W.H. Hutt was part of the group, and Sam Bowstaff. And I thought I'd mention that we would meet on a monthly basis, and each person on a rotating basis would pick a topic that he would choose to discuss, and we'd have it at a different restaurant each time. It was a good time.
If I can just add to that from that time, I was teaching at the University of Dallas, which you mentioned. That's how we met. And W.H. Hutt was there as a professor emeritus. He was suffering from rather bad arthritis, but I would have him come to my classes once a semester to give a guest lecture. And he was very self-deprecating because he had been writing all of these books in the 1930s, in the 40s, in the 50s, into the 60s. And of course, he was so much against the tide, particularly Keynesianism, that he was basically ignored by the economics profession. But it never got him down, I should say that. But anyway, so he comes in one day, and he says, well, I want to thank Professor Ebeling for inviting me to give this lecture in the class. And I noticed that he has handed out one of my articles for you to read in preparation for my coming in today. I want to let you know that most authors have their works forgotten after they're dead. I'm in the unique category. I've had all of my works forgotten while I'm still alive. Other thing, I have to do this. The students loved him. He was a sweet and humorous and cute old guy, okay? But as I said, he had terrible arthritis. And he had to be wheeled around campus in a wheelchair by his wife, Kiki, a delightful, charming woman also, who he had met and married in South Africa. And the students came up with a riddle. Why does Professor Hutt go around campus in a wheelchair? Answer, because he hates canes. He hates canes, get it? Hates canes.
I don't get it.
Work on it. See you next time.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. We're sorry we went over time, but I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And come and visit us at ff.org. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week, where I think we're going to have a special guest.
Yes.
So look forward to it. And see you next week, Richard.
Bye-bye.